government to ensure the transformation of our education sector. And in this wise, in the last 3 days, a set of initiatives have been agreed for implementation by the private sector. And of course, I'll have Mo take us through these 4 initiatives and how we want to go about them post-summit.
Thank you, Frank. So 3 days, 8 plenaries, 7 design workshops, sleepless nights for several people. And we're here at the end of the summit. And the agreement is this is going to be business unusual. This is no longer business as usual. The private sector, the civil society organizations, and the public sector organizations that have participated in this event have all come away with a shared understanding that for us to move these discussions forward, for us to actually have implementation of the suggestions and the recommendations that have come out of this, it is important that we take ownership. And on the part of the private sector, there is a commitment to establish what is called the Private Sector Education Alliance. Thank you. And this alliance is being developed to complement and to support the work that the government is currently doing in education. And how we have discussed the development of this alliance and the mandate that it carries is in 3 parts. And those 3 parts are interventions, advocacy, and policy. We think that it is important, pertaining to interventions, that we come up with initiatives that we can either support or which we can on our own champion. And there have been several commitments already. You would be very happy to hear, Mr. Vice President, sir. There have been several commitments to go away from this forum and begin to do these things. And I will share a few of those examples very briefly with us. There is already the commitment to establish a set of early childhood resource centers to encourage the development of teacher capacity in early childhood. As Jim O'Neill mentioned when he was speaking, Teach for Nigeria will become a reality because again, there is the commitment of institutions such as the Nigerian Commission of Colleges of Education, the National Teachers Institute, private sector organizations like Corona with their iTeach model to make this a reality. We need to review the guidelines for school adoption processes. And so the Adopt a School initiative is going to be reviewed, a framework is going to be established, and this will guide the participation of the private sector in supporting public education. We realize that it is important for the private sector and civil society organizations to be able to channel their investments, whether these be financial investment or human resource investments, based on evidence and based on knowledge. And therefore, there is a commitment to begin to fund and support education projects via a co-sharing mechanism where private sector organizations are able to bring their own corporate interests to bear, bring their own competencies to bear, and work together to deliver on programs on a much larger scale than we currently have been able to do. Another example of an initiative that will happen after the summit is that which pertains to citizen-led assessments of learning, which bring together volunteers from all across the country to determine how well our children are doing. This will be carried out by civil society organizations, private sector organizations, with the commitment of the Federal Ministry of Education. The second area that constitutes a mandate for the Private Sector Education Alliance pertains to advocacy. And therein, the idea is to provide a platform to amplify the voice of civil society organizations who are clamoring for change, development, and improvement in the education sector. And finally, we think that it is important for this alliance to be able to feed into policy. And there already have been commitments regarding how the findings and the recommendations of this summit will feed into platforms such as the National Council of Education and the Federal Executive Council. And you will be happy to know that this Private Sector Education Alliance will be supported by the Nigerian Economic Summit Group.
Thank you very much, Mo. Mr. Vice President, that will be the last aspect of our presentation. With your kind permission, I will just give a closing charge. Mr. Vice President, very distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we have spent 3 days debating the one thing that determines our place in the world, our rank amongst nations and the future that we so dearly desire, the education of our children. We have heard from policymakers. We've also heard from political office holders. We've heard from private organizations, but most especially, we've heard from the very people on whose behalf we have gathered here in the last 3 days. May I therefore call on you today to let history not remember us for what we've said in the last 3 days here, but for us to be remembered for what we do when we leave here today. One thing that has become clear at this summit is that it's not enough to fund education. What is required is to invest in education. When you make investments, you expect returns. The return on our investment as parents, as teachers, as policymakers, as custodians of our country, the private sector and the organized civil society at such a time as this in Nigeria, is only through transformation of our educational sector, reposition Nigeria, that we can reposition Nigeria for global competitiveness. In the words of Walter Cronkite, whatever the cost of our libraries, the price is cheap compared to that of an ignorant nation, end of quote. We would have failed as stakeholders if we leave an ignorant nation to the next generation. Ladies and gentlemen, that was the high-level summary of the 20th Nigerian Economic Summit with the theme, Transforming Education Through Partnerships for Global Competitiveness. Thank you very much. Mr. Vice President, just one additional information. It's my last summit as Director General of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, and I'd like to take this opportunity to pay my deep personal respects to yourself and Mr. President, to indeed the entire cabinet, and indeed to our country for their support in the last 5 years. I'm going to go on to other things, still in the service of our people, and I'm sure that I can always count on your support. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Now he wants to make me cry.